Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that Africa is no longer 55 countries. There are no borders between Kenya and Uganda, no separate customs between Nigeria and Ghana, no passports required to travel from Egypt to South Africa. One government, one enormous internal market, one foreign policy, one military, one currency, and one country, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Cape of Good Hope. It would be one of the most extraordinary political transformations in human history. But here's the real question. Would a united Africa become one of the most powerful countries on Earth? Or would trying to unite more than 1 billion people create one of the biggest political disasters in history? To answer that, we need to look at what Africa would actually have. And the numbers are extraordinary. First, forget everything you think you know about the size of Africa. Africa is not a small continent squeezed between Europe and Asia. It is enormous. Its landmass is roughly 30 million square kilometers. That means a hypothetical United States of Africa would be larger than the United States, China, India, and several other major countries combined in land area. And politically, it would begin with something that already exists, the African Union. The African Union currently consists of 55 member states. So, the idea of Africans cooperating across borders isn't science fiction. The political framework for continental cooperation already exists. The question is how far that cooperation could go, because turning cooperation into one country would change almost everything. Now, consider the people. Africa is home to a rapidly growing population and one of the youngest populations on Earth. That creates a problem, but also an extraordinary opportunity. Imagine combining the labor forces, consumers, entrepreneurs, engineers, scientists, farmers, and students of the entire continent into one enormous economy. Instead of 55 relatively fragmented markets, you suddenly have one gigantic domestic market. A company based in Rwanda could potentially sell to customers in Nigeria without treating the border like an international barrier. A manufacturer in Kenya could source components from Egypt. A software company in Ghana could hire engineers in South Africa. A farmer in Tanzania could sell directly into a much larger continental market. That is the economic dream behind deeper African integration. And there is already a real-world experiment moving in this direction. The African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA. AfCFTA is designed to create a single African market for goods and services. And according to the African Development Bank, full implementation could increase African exports by hundreds of billions of dollars and significantly increase continental income. But imagine taking that concept to its extreme. No internal tariffs, common standards, integrated transportation, shared digital payment systems, continental supply chains, a single customs system. Suddenly, Africa wouldn't just be a collection of countries selling commodities to the rest of the world. It could become a massive manufacturing and consumer market. And that distinction matters, because one of Africa's biggest economic problems has historically been that enormous amounts of raw material leave the continent before much of the value is added. The continent produces resources, but often imports finished products. A united economic market could make it easier to build regional industries around those resources. But then, we reach perhaps the most extraordinary part of this hypothetical country, its natural resources. Africa possesses extraordinary mineral wealth. The African Development Bank estimates that the continent holds around 30% of global mineral reserves. Think about what that means in the modern economy. Copper, cobalt, lithium, manganese, graphite, platinum group metals, gold, uranium, and many other strategically important resources. Some of these minerals are essential for batteries, electronics, renewable energy systems, and modern manufacturing. So imagine a united African government deciding, we are no longer exporting most of these resources as raw materials. We're going to process them here. Instead of exporting lithium, build battery supply chains. Instead of exporting cobalt, develop refining and manufacturing capacity. Instead of simply exporting copper, build electrical equipment and industrial products. The result could be a shift from being primarily a supplier of raw materials to becoming a major industrial center. But resources alone don't make a superpower. The Democratic Republic of Congo has enormous mineral wealth. Nigeria has enormous energy resources. South Africa has major mineral and industrial capabilities. Yet, having resources doesn't automatically create prosperity. You need institutions, infrastructure, capital, technology, and political stability. And that brings us to the biggest problem with our hypothetical country. How do you unite 55 countries? Africa isn't politically or culturally homogeneous. It contains thousands of ethnic groups, hundreds of languages, different legal systems, different religions, different political traditions, different economic structures, different national interests, and enormous geographic distances. Imagine trying to create one government that satisfies Egypt, Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya, Morocco, Ghana, and dozens of other countries simultaneously. Who gets to lead? Where is the capital? Which language becomes the official language? Which legal system becomes dominant? How are taxes collected? How are natural resources distributed? And perhaps the most difficult question, how do you prevent the largest countries from dominating everyone else? A political union would therefore require something much more complicated than simply drawing a new flag. It would require an entirely new constitutional system. Now, let's talk about military power. A united Africa would inherit the armed forces of dozens of countries. That would mean enormous combined military manpower, extensive territory, and strategic access to both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, as well as the Mediterranean and Red Sea regions. Geographically, that would be extraordinary. A united African state would sit beside some of the world's most important shipping routes. The Suez Canal is already one of the world's most strategically important trade corridors. The Red Sea connects Europe and Asia. The Atlantic connects Africa to the Americas. The Indian Ocean connects Africa to the Middle East and Asia. A unified foreign policy could therefore give Africa significantly more bargaining power internationally. But, again, there is a catch. Military strength isn't simply the number of soldiers. It depends on technology, logistics, industrial capacity, intelligence, training, command structures, and most importantly, political stability. A huge military divided by internal political conflicts would not necessarily make the country powerful. Now, imagine combining Africa's energy resources. North Africa has enormous solar potential. Central and Southern Africa possess major hydropower opportunities. Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, and other countries have significant oil and gas resources. Countries across the continent also have enormous potential for solar and wind power. A unified continental electricity market could theoretically connect regions with different energy strengths. Hydropower from one region, solar from another, wind from another, gas and other energy sources where appropriate. Electricity could move across borders through massive interconnected grids, and that could transform one of Africa's biggest development constraints, access to reliable electricity. But again, there is a difference between potential and reality. Building those systems would require trillions of dollars in infrastructure investment. Roads, railways, ports, power lines, fiber optic networks, water systems, factories, and cities. Which leads to perhaps the most important question of all. The answer is possibly, but not quickly. The biggest mistake would be assuming that political unity automatically creates economic success. It doesn't. A united Africa could still have corruption, inequality, conflict, weak institutions, poor infrastructure, debt, unemployment, and political competition. In fact, putting all those problems under one government could initially make some of them worse. But there is another possibility. Instead of immediately becoming one country, Africa could gradually become more integrated. Free movement, common trade rules, regional infrastructure, cross-border energy markets, common digital payment systems, shared industrial projects, more intra-African trade, then perhaps, decades later, deeper political integration. That approach is much more realistic. And, interestingly, Africa is already moving in that direction. The most powerful version of this story isn't necessarily Africa becomes one country, it's Africa becomes one economic system. Imagine a continent where goods can move efficiently across borders, where African companies can operate across multiple countries, where African savings finance African infrastructure, where minerals are processed locally, where agricultural products are transformed into finished goods, where electricity crosses national borders, where African universities collaborate, where technology companies scale across the continent, and where African countries negotiate internationally with much greater coordination. That could create something extremely powerful without requiring every country to surrender its sovereignty. And there is another enormous issue: money. Would there be one African currency? Imagine replacing dozens of currencies with a single continental currency. No exchange rate problems between member states, simpler trade, potentially lower transaction costs. But creating a single currency is extremely difficult. Europe's experience with the euro demonstrates why. Countries with different economies cannot simply share a currency and expect everything to work automatically. One country might experience a boom, while another experiences a recession. One may need higher interest rates, while another desperately needs lower ones. So, a united African currency would require extraordinarily strong financial institutions, a common central bank, fiscal coordination, banking regulation, and enormous political trust. Without that, the currency could become a source of instability rather than strength. So, would a united Africa become a superpower? Potentially. The ingredients are there: a huge population, a massive land area, extraordinary mineral wealth, energy potential, strategic coastlines, a young workforce, rapidly growing economies, and a massive potential internal market. The African Development Bank projects continental GDP growth of around 4.2% in 2026, despite major global uncertainties. But potential isn't destiny. Africa doesn't become powerful simply because it has resources. It becomes powerful if those resources are transformed into productive industries, infrastructure, technology, education, jobs, and institutions that people trust. So perhaps the better question isn't, what if Africa became one country? Perhaps it's, what happens if Africa learns to act like one? Because the continent doesn't need to erase its 55 countries to become more powerful. It needs to make those countries work together. Imagine a continent where a border doesn't stop an entrepreneur, where a lack of electricity doesn't stop a factory, where a mineral leaves the ground, and the battery made from it is manufactured on the continent, where African companies compete globally instead of primarily competing against one another at home, where Africa doesn't simply export its potential, but builds with it. That would not require one president, one flag, or one capital. It would require something much harder: coordination. Africa becoming one country tomorrow is almost impossible. But Africa becoming far more integrated, that's already happening. And if the continent can turn its enormous resources, population, and markets into coordinated economic power, the question won't be, could Africa become a superpower? The question will be, why did it take so long? If you want more documentaries exploring the facts, geography, and future of our world, subscribe, because the next story might completely change the way you see the planet.